So thank you for giving us the chance to interview with you. So our topic today is about like Chinese economy, right? My first question for you is about the Chinese economy, economic environment in general. As we know, like China has experienced rapid economic growth since 1978 after the market-oriented reform took place. And despite China's reform agenda, there appears to be some conventional wisdom that consider Chinese economy as a model of state capitalism. But in your recent book called Markets Over Mao, you argue that it's actually a private business in China that has contributed most of the economic growth. Can you elaborate on this and tell us some of the misperceptions that people have?
I think the main misperception is the one that you mentioned, and that this idea somehow has a unique model of state capitalism that was adopted after 1978. But I think what China actually did was move very, very strongly over time towards a market-driven economy. They allowed the creation of private businesses. They put fewer and fewer restrictions on them. They allowed them to compete against state companies over broader parts of the economy. And the banking system was willing to lend them considerable sums so that they could grow their businesses rapidly. So the private part of the economy was responsible in the first 35 years for most of the growth of output, almost all the growth of employment, and increasingly was important in generating the exports that were so characteristic of China's reform period. So I think it was really the rise of the market and private businesses that generated most of the growth. So I didn't think state capitalism was exactly the right way to capture that. So I thought we should really recognize China as a more market-driven economy.
Then why do you think like people have this kind of misperception? Is it because like the source of information like people usually get is like misleading? Or?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, and one was the fact that state companies did remain very important in certain sectors. The oil and gas industry was dominated by a handful of state firms. The telecommunications industry was dominated by a handful of state firms. The banking and insurance industry was completely dominated by state firms. So if you only looked at those areas, it seemed like it was a very state-driven economy. But if you looked at the broader range of economic activity in manufacturing and increasingly in services, it was really private firms, entrepreneurs, capitalists that were moving the economy forward.
And I know that like doing these studies in China's economy also involve a lot of data things, but there's always like a questions or skepticisms that consider about the reliability of the data provided by government. Like how do you make of it, or how do you think of this data? Do you think like the government is like manufacturing data?
Well, I think the quality of Chinese data varies from area to area, and it has improved over time. And certain data is accurate but not very meaningful because they're not really trying to measure the right thing. But I don't think there's any systematic evidence that the government has actually falsified data at the national level. Some provincial governments overreport how much they're producing. But one of the things that led me to the belief that the data were fairly accurate is in this period when the private firms became more and more important, they were consistently more profitable, more efficient than state firms. And I wrote in that book about Markets Over Mao, if the government is really manufacturing all this data, why are they making it seem like state companies are so inefficient and private companies are so successful? It didn't really make much sense. So that led me to the view, or reinforced the view, that the data for the most part was reasonably accurate, not falsified. It doesn't mean it's all perfect or accurate to the last decimal place, but I think in general the data that China produces is of reasonably high quality.
Great, thank you. And talking about the book, we also know that like you have a new book coming up in less than a week, right? It's titled "The State Strikes Back: The End of Economic Reform in China" with a question mark, right?
Yes.
Congratulations first. And can you tell us briefly about this book? Give brief preview about this book to the audience.
Well, basically this book looks at the last 5 years and argues that a lot of market-oriented reforms that had been moving ahead so strongly are now being rolled back. Private firms are getting squeezed out. They're getting much, much less access to credit. Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the party, has consistently talked since he came into office in 2012 about making state enterprises bigger. And this has been interpreted as a signal by the state-controlled banks that they should lend more money to state companies so they can expand and become bigger. So private firms have been gradually squeezed out from getting access to credit. Their share of investment as a result has been declining the last few years. And this is despite the fact that state companies are becoming less and less productive. That is, their efficiency is declining. So even as their efficiency is declining, they're getting a larger share of society's resources. They're investing a larger share, but they're producing relatively less. So this is a rollback of the market-oriented reform. Credit is not being allocated based on efficiency. The most efficient enterprises are getting squeezed out. And as a result, I argue in this book that I think China's potential growth, if they had a more market-oriented system, is significantly higher than what they've actually achieved in the last 5 to 10 years.
Does it have anything to do with the policies as well? Like the policies regarding the policies on the state-owned enterprise and also the private businesses? Yeah.
Yes, I think the policies have become less supportive of private businesses, and a lot of private, not a lot, but a number of private entrepreneurs have had their businesses taken over by the state. They've been expropriated, and this has undermined the confidence of entrepreneurs, capitalists, private business people. They're a little more reluctant to invest. Why should they be building up their businesses if the government might take the business away from them and not compensate them properly? So the party is facing a problem that the property rights of private businesses have not been protected adequately, and as a result, the contribution of the private business to economic growth is below what it could be.
And as you had mentioned, the state-owned enterprises got policy support, but the record shows that the return on assets on these enterprises are actually lower. What kind of reason do you think leads to that?
Well, it's very hard. It's hard to know for sure, but the gap between productivity in state firms and private firms has expanded dramatically since the global financial crisis. If you look in the industrial sector, private firms are about 3.5 times more productive than state firms. So it's not a small marginal difference, it's an actually quite large difference. I think one of the reasons is there's less competition in the sectors where state firms dominate. They introduced a lot of competitive forces back in the late 90s. They cut tariffs, they joined the WTO, and they haven't really continued a strong economic reform agenda. Rather, they've been merging these big conglomerates, these big group companies in China. They've been merging them to form even larger firms. So these mergers take place in particular industries, and they reduce competition. So the remaining firm in the industry has very little incentive to innovate or to control costs, and so their productivity does not evolve in a very satisfactory manner. I think also there's a problem of corruption. These big state enterprises, these conglomerates, sometimes have hundreds of subordinate firms, and at the top of the system, the top of the holding company or the conglomerate, they're transferring resources from one company to another. There's not much transparency, there's not much accountability, and it looks like this kind of an environment is very conducive to a considerable amount of corruption. So if a lot of money is flowing into the pockets of a few people at the top of these conglomerates, then the reported profits will be lower and their productivity will be less than it would be. So I think the governance structure, the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability in state firms is a significant factor contributing to their low reported return on assets.
Well, speaking of corruption, well, we know that like currently, these few years, like some anti-corruption actions are going on. Do you think like this anti-corruption actions will make this state-owned enterprise doing better?
It's very hard to know. Certainly Xi Jinping has put a very high priority on his anti-corruption campaign really since about the time of the 18th Party Congress. And many high-level officials have lost their jobs. And in the process of these investigations, it's been disclosed the amount of kickbacks and other illegal funding that they have received. Presumably that is a deterrent to other people participating in this kind of corrupt activity. But corruption by its very nature is almost impossible to measure. We don't know whether his campaign has reduced, hopefully it's reduced corruption, but it's very hard to prove.
Thank you. So in your previous talk, you emphasized the importance of like supporting the private businesses. Well, in your opinion, if the government continues to do what it's doing right now, do you think like Chinese economy will slow down? Is inevitable?
I think there's an understanding among economists in China that the Xi Jinping strategy of emphasizing state companies is slowing down China's economic growth. I think there's some confusion on this. I think in the West, some people think the slowdown is largely due to the tariff conflict with the United States. I think it's much more fundamental. Even if the tariff dispute with the United States could be resolved fairly quickly, this drag on economic growth from inefficient state companies is a much more fundamental problem that will require a very substantial change in policy.
Since you have mentioned the tariff, can you tell us your opinions about like the U.S. and China the trade controversy? Like, what do you think of it? So many people call it a trade war. Do you think it's really that serious to call it a war?
I think it's probably a little bit of an overstatement at this point to call it a trade war. But if President Trump follows through on his statements that he will increase tariffs on some goods from 15% up to 25% and expand tariffs so that they cover all Chinese goods coming into the United States, then the magnitude of the effort, I think, would be sufficiently large that we could think of it as a trade war. Not yet, but it might become a trade war.
What is your perspective about this trade war? What do you think this controversy will lead to?
Well, it's very difficult to tell. The negotiations that have occurred over the months, periodically there have been negotiations, but there's been very little disclosure by either side about the nature of the discussions, what the United States is asking for, what the Chinese government is willing to do in response to the request from the United States. So with the lack of concrete information, there are a lot of rumors, speculation about what the positions of the two governments are. But without concrete information about that, it's very difficult to anticipate what the outcome might be. We do observe that President Trump has sometimes claimed victory when very little has really changed. He renegotiated NAFTA to now have this new agreement with the three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And he's claimed it's the best agreement we've ever had. It's such a huge improvement over the previous one. But the trade economists that have looked at it very carefully say that really not very much has changed. It's old wine in new bottles or something like that, that very little has changed. But that has not deterred the president from claiming that it's a great victory. And I think a lot of people accept that. They don't have the expertise to go and get their magnifying glasses out and look at the fine print
Yeah.
to really see how much, if anything, has changed.
Mhm. There's also another like major criticism on China's from the U.S. It's called like the forced technology transfer. So based on your analysis, do China's like really force foreign companies to surrender like sensitive technologies?
Well, I certainly think there are examples
Mhm.
of forced technology transfer, but I think the magnitude of the problem has been exaggerated by the U.S. government. And one of the reasons I think that is that these days, almost all the foreign investment going into China is in the form of wholly owned companies. In the old days, most investment going into China was in joint ventures, and when a foreign firm contributed technology to the joint venture, the Chinese partner firm automatically got access to that technology. In a wholly foreign owned company, you don't have to share your technology. You can take appropriate steps to prevent that technology, or to prevent the transfer of that technology, or at least reduce the possibility that it would be acquired by a competitive Chinese firm. So given this large increase in the share of investment that's in the form of wholly owned companies, I think there's been a tendency to overstate the amount of forced technology transfer. I think it was very large 25, 30 years ago. I think it has been steadily declining over the last couple of decades. But the U.S. position does not recognize that.
There's like a recent case related to this like technology things about like the Huawei, the issues. What's your opinions on that?
Well, I don't think anybody has accused Huawei of illegally acquiring foreign technology. I think it should be recognized that Huawei is a private firm that has been extraordinarily successful, that they invest a huge amount of money in research and development, that some of their technology is in the forefront globally, for example, for 5G. And the main concern about Huawei is whether or not they're making backdoors available so that the Chinese government could have access to the information flows over their network. I mean, this is, as far as I can tell, this is a hypothetical concern. I don't see that anybody has proved that this will be the case or has been the case.
Thank you. So we'll end this last question. Well, this year is like the 40th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between China and the U.S. And looking back to this past 40 years, how would you like characterize the major trend of U.S. And China trade relations? And what do you think like these two countries should do better to better their economic relationship in the future?
Well, I think, the economic relationship has gone from strength to strength. Initially, the trade flows were absolutely teeny. There was no investment. China didn't even have a law that allowed foreign investment into the country when reform began in 1978. But gradually that all changed. China opened up to foreign investment. American firms and other foreign firms began to invest there. Trade flows increased dramatically. And then as China lowered its tariffs to come into the WTO, the market became more open, so that China became a very major, it's the biggest trading country on the globe. And I think there have been enormous benefits for China and enormous benefits for the rest of the world as a result of this deepening trade relationship. Now, the critics point out that China's not as open as the United States. There are still issues of market access, and those should be addressed. I think the question that I would ask is whether or not unilaterally imposing tariffs, as President Trump did, is the most effective way to resolve some of the frictions in the trade and investment relationship. We'll have to wait and see how successful the negotiation is, whether there is a successful conclusion, but I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that imposing tariffs, as first the United States did it, then China retaliated, these tariffs are imposing very substantial costs on the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy, costs in terms of higher prices and reduced employment. A lot of firms under stress as a result of having to pay higher prices for inputs. So I think it would be a benefit to both sides if we could get beyond the tariff war and address the remaining trade fictions in a less disruptive way.
Thank you. Those are very good sharings. Thank you so much for coming to this interview.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.